Welcome to Pharmacy View, Technology and Pharmacy Business podcast series, where we provide regular interviews with pharmacists and key industry people within the Australian pharmacy and associated industry. In each podcast, we look to discuss aspects of pharmacy operation and how technology is improving or interacting with each guest's current role or pharmacy related business. I'm your host, Scott Carpenter, and today's guest is sponsored by Shopfront Solutions, leading the way in digital marketing and communications, providing a cloud-based platform for pharmacies to manage all of their digital and print collateral and messaging. I'm talking today with Sarah Stoddart from Vitality Law Australia, where Sarah's passion is providing legal knowledge and education to individuals and small business owners in the healthcare industry. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here.
That's great to hear. Sarah, well, I've no doubt there'll be a few listeners today who know you. For others who haven't had the pleasure of working with you, who is Sarah Stoddart?
So, I'm a commercial lawyer with expertise in the healthcare industry, particularly pharmacy. So, I've been working with pharmacists for around about the last 8 years in all facets of their business, from transactions to approvals, leasing, employment matters, and occasionally disciplinary matters as well. I also impart as much education and knowledge as I can to pharmacists. So I've been involved in conferences as well as providing training sessions as part of a business breakfast series. In addition to my work as a lawyer, I'm also a mum, and I live in Brisbane but work with pharmacists across Australia.
Thanks, Sarah. So, again, I've had the opportunity to listen to a couple of other podcast sessions that you've done. So, if there was a key area that you work in with pharmacists, what would that be?
I think probably it would be the transactional side coupled with the approval side, which often comes out of the transaction. So obviously, if someone's buying a pharmacy, that's a transaction, but there needs to be an approval of that by way of a application to state and federal regulator. So that's my main areas of work with pharmacists.
Okay. And yeah, look, I certainly, from my background over a few years ago, I got involved with a little bit of that. So I understand from that perspective. I might put a link into, or actually, I noticed on your webpage there's a couple of links to your other podcasts. So I'll refer people there if they're interested in hearing that. But I also noticed you do a little bit of work around leasing and also employment law. Is there some things that you can tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, a majority of pharmacy premises are leased. A couple of them are owned, which is fortunate for that pharmacist, but mainly they are leased. And that means working with landlords, obviously, for new lease negotiations, transfer of leases, renewals. And interesting during the COVID period, rent relief was obviously a big issue. Employment law, there is obviously the Pharmacy Industry Award, and that is what governs most employment relationships in the pharmacy industry. But just like any business where there's staff, issues do come up. So I look after every element of the employment relationship, from the onboarding of a new staff member to managing their employment, I suppose, including things like flexible working arrangements or an unfortunate event such as injury, right through to working with employers around terminations or performance management issues.
Cool. And I'm sure there's been a few people out there that have been involved in those sessions, and they can be challenging at best. I might chat a little bit later on with you around that employment law, particularly around the technology side of the business. We recorded another podcast a day or two ago around data and cybersecurity, and certainly one of the things that came up is that the greatest risk in that area is sometimes the way employees use or access the technology systems in their platform. So we might have a chat a little bit later about that and to what the risks are within,
Yeah,
relative to
sure.
employers, employee law. So I also noticed from your LinkedIn profile page, you director with the Queensland Alliance for Mental Health. I might have that wrong, have I?
I am. Yes, I'm a non-executive director with the
Director, yep,
Alliance. I've
yep.
been on the board for about 2 years, but involved with the Alliance for coming up to 5 years, I think. I started on the governance subcommittee there and was appointed to the board shortly after. I now chair the governance subcommittee and am actively involved on the board. So for those that don't know, the Queensland Alliance for Mental Health is the peak body for the community mental health sector in Queensland, and it obviously represents the state at a federal level as well. So some very interesting work being done there, particularly around the introduction of the NDIS system. And we've actually just released our new strategic plan, which is about how the mental health sector is going to look in the future, which is very interesting coming out of the COVID environment where obviously mental health issue for many people.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, and certainly sitting here in Victoria, and we're celebrating today because we're well and truly out now. There's still a few restrictions around the place, but certainly the extended period of lockdown has created some real challenges for us down here. So that's a really broad spectrum. Then I guess, but it gives you a really good focus on health businesses and the health industry. So is that your passion, or is that where you've fallen into? How did that all come about?
I have to admit I did fall into it, Scott. It wasn't something that I thought I'd end up in. As some people may be aware, my father, Stephen Stoddart, is also a solicitor and has been in the health industry for 40 odd years. So I got in it, I suppose, under his guide and leadership, and having worked with him for a period of 8 years. And that's sort of how it all became about. It is not an area of law that we learn at university. You can't buy a textbook on it, but it is an area that I certainly enjoy and am now very passionate about. And as I mentioned, I particularly enjoy educating pharmacists on the business side of their business because I understand that's not something they actually learn about at university either.
Correct. No, that's really good. So on that note, then let's move into, I guess, a focus of discussion today is around the technology that you use or interact with, and we had a brief discussion the other day, particularly around the COVID environment and the remote location working. Now, I would imagine with sale of business or transactions across Australia, you've done a fair bit of remote work with them anyway. But has this ramped up, and what systems and processes do you use? You know, if there was a pharmacist listening to this today, what areas would they need to potentially work different, not being able to meet with you face to face?
I've worked with pharmacists across Australia for my whole time in pharmacy, so it's not foreign to me, and certainly wasn't foreign when COVID came about, which is a good thing. Obviously, the working from home arrangements have made things a bit more challenging, although it certainly with technology has enabled things to remain on foot. Obviously, with the use of email and what have you. Fortunately, exchange of contracts and notices are permitted by email, and that's often expressly referred to in the contract. So that means we can still get matters started and we don't need to wait for the post. That obviously gives certainty for both parties faster, as well as contributing to lower costs. For some people, that exchange of contracts by email is something that's new. A lot of people still are used to working on paper and expect that the contract does need to be sent around by post, whereas that's not the case. So technology certainly has helped there, and it's good that I suppose the contracts had provision in that before COVID times, so that we didn't have to be madly scrambling to change documents. Then, of course, once you're in that contract phase, there's often due diligence. Data rooms and Dropbox have been a great resource for the exchange of information for due diligence. So, again, historically, some people have been handed, wads of paper by a seller, or it's gone through the accountant, whereas now you can exchange data and information on those platforms, which is obviously, again, more time and cost effective. In addition to that, I understand that a lot of these platforms or other programs on computers actually can assist with interpreting the data. And you'll appreciate with pharmacy businesses, there's a lot of data to interpret. So the most assistance you can get with that.
I guess again, Sarah, I've made reference to my history in a few other podcasts, and I've certainly been around in the time where big thick envelopes of information would turn up,
Yeah.
and I guess the reality today is that it's all potentially live. It's shared documents, it's shared or secure, but shared information.
Mm.
Um, have you found that from a pharmacist and a pharmacy team who are always busy? We know that that this is a has improved the way that we get information to the pharmacists and the pharmacy teams, or the buyers and sellers, or is it still a challenge given how busy they can be?
It has improved the way that information is provided and exchanged between parties, but as you have quite correctly identified, we are dealing with very busy professionals here. So I suppose whilst the data is being made available to them quicker and more in a more accessible manner, they still need to find that time to interpret it. And I think that's where programs, as well as enlisting the assistance from their advisors, and commonly that's their accountant, has really helped them because obviously just because it's there more quickly doesn't mean there's more hours.
Yeah, so and that was, I guess, just confirming that it was the use of the likes of cloud-based or internet-based data rooms and Dropbox facilities.
Yeah.
So at any point in time, I sometimes have the really bad habit of waking up early in the morning, and as much as you're not meant to, I'll jump on and do a little bit of work while my mind is fresh,
Mm.
clear it up, and I guess it's the advantage of being able to work in these shared documents or these shared rooms without having someone's email or phone kind of ding or beep at 2 o'clock in the morning because I've sent them an email. So
Absolutely. And I think too it assists with version control, because if you're getting a document by email and working on it, you don't actually know whether the other person, particularly from a solicitor's point of view, is working on that document at the same time. And then, of course, if you're making amendments and so are they, it becomes very difficult to know which document is the current document. So these programs certainly assist with version control as well, which is really important. I should just add that during the course of this year, I am aware there's been a few litigious matters as well. I'm not directly involved in them, but it's interesting seeing the courts move online and parties adopting that process as well. So these are pharmacy litigation matters, and working with the courts on platforms like Dropbox as well as online courtrooms has been very interesting to observe.
yeah, no, look, again, as an example, I was working with a colleague of mine on a business presentation in the last week, and we were using a shared document, and we basically decided not that there was two differing points of view, but it was just easier that we both had the document open online and we were both making amendments to it and watching them happen as
Mm,
we were typing, kind of thing. So it's almost like you're in the room talking to someone, but you're working on this document from a remote location, which to me is now the new norm and not necessarily a bad thing.
yeah.
Um, so, Sarah, if we talk about technology and the buying and selling in pharmacies, I think something that came to my mind, and again, you mentioned some of the challenges in one of your other podcasts that I listened to, that the sale of business is extremely multifaceted. You're buying a pharmacy business, but you're buying all of the technology platforms that are already in place, and so is it has it been easy or is it complex? If a pharmacist is looking at buying or selling a pharmacy, where does the systems like the websites and the social medias and the email platforms sit? That obviously forms part of the business, but you're dealing with third party entities here, aren't you?
Yeah, you absolutely are. And interestingly, despite social media really being entrenched in our lives now, the definition of business assets, at least in the Queensland Standard contract, isn't actually inclusive of social media. So that means that when acting for a buyer, we really need to turn our mind to whether or not there is social media linked to this particular business as well as websites. If there is, and the buyer wants to continue with those, to ensure that they are put into the contract that they transfer across. That, of course, means getting passwords and usernames from the seller, and that can be challenging, particularly where those business pages are linked to the seller's personal Facebook or Instagram account, or whatever other social media platform they're using. So that's one challenge, is uncoupling from personal accounts. But you're absolutely right that these are third-party platforms, which raises an interesting point in terms of, you hear about Facebook shutting pages down if there's particular information or what have you. It's very interesting in terms of transferring a Facebook page, then the liability of previous posts and where that actually sits. Now, I haven't had an opportunity to explore that in a litigious sense or had any challenge to it. It's just an observation that I make. So, social media accounts is certainly something that is always interesting. Also, just the software that pharmacies use generally. So obviously, they've got, whatever system they're using, whether it be Fred or the other ones that are available to them. If the buyer wants to continue using those same programs, and that is easy, but if the buyer wants to introduce new programs, you often have a situation where the buyer from day one wants to have those programs available and running on their systems, but they don't actually own the pharmacy until that day one. So it makes it hard for a buyer to set up their systems because, understandably, the seller doesn't want to let them in to their computer systems and IT, particularly the sort of behind the scenes IT, to change things around, because obviously that presents risks for the seller in continuing to operate their business appropriately, but also in the event there is a delay or, of course, if the contract does happen to crash, then their systems have all been compromised by the buyer. So technology, whilst being a huge part of our lives for a long time now, there's still these quirks and things that come up. And of course, technology is changing so fast, you have to keep up with it and always think about what could happen, even if it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and I would imagine then, part of the due diligence process would have to include, digging in and discovering all that because in some instances, a seller may not have thought about that, or it might not be part of an existing checklist. So it's almost like every purchase, sale of business would have additional, check items around technology and social media.
Definitely. Yeah. And some people don't want to inherit the social media that exists in a business, maybe because it's got a poor history, or maybe because they're going to change the name of the business. So then, from a consumer perspective, I think there is some confusion if a page continues to operate, but the business has been sold. So in that case, you have to look at including something in your contract that actually forces, where possible, the seller to actually deactivate or close down past social media accounts. The issue then is, well, what about the followers on those accounts and the likers? How do you transition them to a new page, which is very difficult when you're dealing with third parties who have a choice as to who and what they follow.
Yeah, I would imagine also then there would be instances where it's potentially the retail manager or one of the pharmacy assistants or the dispensary technicians, potentially the page manager or the platform manager for this social media. And in the sale of business, I've certainly had experience in the past where the pharmacist owner don't necessarily share with any expediency that the business is, under a sale of contract. So that would raise challenges as well, because in some cases the buyer wouldn't know about these until almost, the day before.
Yeah, that's true. And there is actually provision in contracts saying that the parties can't disclose the existence of the contract or the sale of the business without the consent of the other party. So there's always sensitivity around these transactions. But if there is particular sensitivity for whatever reason from either party, so obviously a seller doesn't always want their customers to know they're moving on, and from a buyer's perspective, you want to protect the goodwill, so you may not want the customers to know until late in the piece. So it is very tricky then to, as you say, transition and communicate what's going on when you've got kind of contract provisions and all these different platforms where you've got consumers who may or may not actively engage with the business in terms of coming into store, but they are there and they're watching. And that's very interesting with social media, that people know what's going on, even if they haven't actually set foot in your business or engaged with you for some time.
Absolutely correct, and would imagine that in the year 2020, where we've become a bit more homebound and a bit more internet requirements and internet savvy, that you are following and watching business of interest to yourself. So,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know in my experience that I had my son during the COVID period, so I wasn't going out much, and I needed something from a chemist, and I engaged with them on Facebook to check that they had the product before I actually went down there. Now, whether or not I've subsequently been added to a mailing list or anything like that, I'm not sure yet. But I am now, you could say I am a customer of theirs. So if something happened to their pharmacy in terms of a transaction, how would they communicate that to me? Maybe in a couple of months' time, I'm in a similar situation, message them and don't get a response. How does that look from the business if they're then suddenly not engaging with it?
yeah, no, I understand. It certainly it just opens up quite wide the considerations that a buyer and seller now has to look at.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. In terms of the main, third party platforms, your dispensary point of sale systems, I would
Mm.
imagine that they're a fairly tight services contract anyway. They're a known entity, um, to a point. They're a trusted entity. So, is it feasible that those parties are included in the data room earlier, or are they also left kind of until the last minute to make sure that this actually goes ahead?
Yeah, they're actually often left until the last minute. or you're facing a situation where perhaps you're asking these third parties to sign non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements, and we're dealing with big entities here that are servicing a lot of pharmacies, so they could have any number of transactions going on at the one time, so they are still brought in late to the piece. A lot of these systems, though, I find month to month accounts, so if they are finished up by a seller or a buyer not continuing with them, it is fairly easy to sever the relationship and introduce a new system. It just is the timing of that, because obviously the buyer wants to hit the ground running, and that's not always possible when you're making changes.
Yeah, no, look, I've certainly got some experience from that going back quite a few years now ago. And you talk about the quick or the brief changeover. I was involved in the purchase of some pharmacies here in Victoria with a company I was working with at the time, and initially when we started the program, we would continue with whoever the vendor was, and then over the space of the next month, we would transition to the companies or the preferred vendor.
Mm.
We got to the point where we worked out it was just actually easier to bite the bullet and change it all overnight. So basically, on the night that stock take was happening, we also had electricians and computer techs and uh, dispensary point of sale vendors in there, and we would open next morning with all the existing data, but in actual fact with the new platform, and the business would put a couple of key people in there that knew this, so that the existing staff, they usually only found out about this a couple of days before anyway, so they were already in a state of shock. So we just
Yes.
we just felt that it was easier just to bite the bullet and make it happen, but have people there that knew how to use the preferred system, because when you, as you'd appreciate, you're buying and selling pharmacies, there's multiple dispensary point of sale vendors involved in that. So
Yeah, and also I suppose your connection in with Medicare as well, and getting your approval number into your system. You actually have to have your system operating, whoever you're choosing to go with for your dispensing point of sale, to enable your approval number to be activated. We have had a few mad moments where a pharmacy is trading and the approval number hasn't gone in yet because there is an issue with the dispensing system, and then you've got a situation where you're having to hold claims back. So yeah, that's a
yeah, no, not a fun time, I'm sure. So that probably then brings me to the point that we half discussed earlier on. As I mentioned, we recorded a podcast a couple of days ago around pharmacy data and cybersecurity and some of the things that you should consider. And I'd probably like to tie this back into your employment law side of things. And there was a point in time where employment law might have been making sure that team members were, I guess, being employed under the right terms, but also working, for the employer under the right terms, and just technology bring a whole new facet, particularly around security of information. I know as a rule, pharmacy is pretty good around privacy, but you often can't control what's happening in the internet sense. And one of the key points that came up in this other podcast was that you'll often walk into a pharmacy and you'll find post-it notes on the computer screen with all the password
mm,
entries. So
yeah.
have you come across anything around this area in terms of the employment law side of things?
So definitely. So one thing that comes to mind as you mentioned about the post-it notes, and I actually know from my own experience in working as a pharmacy assistant while I was still studying, you did know other people's codes. And I mean, I say that it sounds like, shock horror, how could that be the case? But I think it is fairly common practice. You're in busy stores, and you might only be a casual or over the Christmas casual. To set you up as a new user can sometimes be really difficult in a busy time, so you did know other people's codes, whether in your head or because there's a laminated sheet behind the cash and wrap counter. And actually, I was in a pharmacy last week and saw just that. So there is a security issue from obviously the public becoming aware of that information, but also tracking movements on tills. And that is something I have advised on a number of times, where there may be a theft issue going on, but the person that is doing that is using someone else's code. So it then becomes very difficult to prove that that person is doing it, because then they're going in as someone else. Of course, there is security cameras in a lot of pharmacies. That creates its own privacy issue around where those security cameras are placed. both from an employee perspective, but also from your consumer perspective. Because if you do have customers being shown on that, they need to be aware that there is CCTV footage being recorded in the pharmacy. So that is certainly an issue around security. Also, one thing that's come up is labels being printed and left lying around. You then know the customer's name. It might be, for example, on the script in or out counter, there might be a label sitting there for whatever reason. That's obviously very private and sensitive information, which sometimes is inadvertently, left for other people to see. The other massive issue that I see in employment law, and it's not just isolated to pharmacy businesses, but it's common in pharmacy, I guess, because it's the nature of small business still, and they are small businesses. And that is the expansion of what actually is the workplace. Because if you have an employee that on their Facebook page says that they work at, XYZ chemist, um, suddenly the scope of their workplace has broadened. And now, if they are linking themselves back to their employer, their conduct in social media, whether that be during work or personal time, is suddenly reflecting on the reputation of the employer. I have done a lot of work in that space where they might be making inflammatory comments on their Facebook page, not referencing their employer, but maybe saying, my boss was, really mean, but because they've got a link to where they work, then it makes it very clear who their boss is. So that's one issue, but also from a behaviour and conduct perspective, they're posting what they're doing on weekends, which may not be appropriate, which is then reflective of the employer. So it's really dangerous territory, and my advice, very broadly, is don't link your personal and your work together. It's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, no, it was something I learnt many years ago, and a tip for some people is that I run a pseudonym name for my personal social media and
Right.
my full name for any of my business accounts. And now it's not necessarily hard to potentially tie the two together, but I just was given this advice that if you're going to run personal but you're involved in business, potentially look at running two different names so that people still know who you are, kind of thing. But it's not as easy to kind of track the two of you together. So.
Hmm.
Sarah, that's been great to chat today. And I think that whole employment law around technology and social media might need another discussion one day,
Absolutely.
because I'm sure there's a lot of pharmacists and pharmacist managers out there that wouldn't have necessarily considered this or potentially have, but not really sure of the ramifications. So I'd love to kind of get you back in a couple of months' time after Christmas, and maybe we have a bit more of a chat about that. But
Yeah, that'd be
is
great.
is there any other areas or any other passions that you've got that we could have a chat with before we wrap up?
This is an area of work that I thoroughly enjoy, and that is the applications to the Australian Community Pharmacy Authority as well as to. So, if some people listening haven't transacted in the pharmacy world or sought an approval in recent times, perhaps the last year or so, they may not be aware that PBS has now moved to an online portal. So, gone are the days of having to send wads of information down to Canberra. Now it's all done online. Now that's very good. It means it can be done from anywhere at any time, and is paper saving, of course. You don't need to wonder about the post or stand in line to submit the application. And there are a lot of stories about people lining up at the ACPA to get their application in first. It also means you get immediate confirmation of receipt when your application is lodged, which is really good for peace of mind. So I just wanted to raise that so people that aren't aware of it, it is now this online portal. It is a little bit tricky to navigate at first, and if you are using a solicitor, then they'll probably be doing it for you anyway. But I just thought I'd flag that as another way that technology has come into this space.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. We did have that in our notes, and again, it might be something we can discuss in a bit more depth in the new year.
Cool.
But I guess on that note, Sarah, if someone listening today wanted to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that? And we'll include these links in the show notes.
So my business, Vitality Law Australia, has both a Facebook and Instagram page, so you can find it with the handle Vitality Law Australia on both of those. For me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn under my name, Sarah Stoddart, or feel free to engage with me by email, sarah@vitalitylawaustralia.com.
Thanks, Sarah. That's been great to chat with you today, and I look forward to potentially chatting again in the new year. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it.